Yes, today we're going to talk about aggregate demand. But first of all, I want to just say about the withdrawals and leakages and injections. The book and in A level they talk about equilibrium and disequilibrium. Obviously, when injections equal leakages, we've got the system, the economic system's in equilibrium, and it becomes in disequilibrium when you have more injections or less injections than withdrawals. So obviously that will change the national income, probably maybe just the prices, the money flow, but you have the system in disequilibrium and that must adjust itself, maybe to stimulating more growth or to higher prices. But the system is in disequilibrium, and that's the language we have to use for A level. Now, if we look at aggregate demand, remember demand is what consumers want and are willing to pay for a product, and aggregate demand, we're talking about the macro demand. So we're talking about all the demand in the economy. We're not talking about a market, which we call demand, but aggregate demand is all the demand in the economy. And this is calculated by adding up consumer spending, investment, government spending, exports minus imports. We use these letters to indicate those components, but we can imagine, you need, in an economy, you've got to have some investment to maintain the factors of production, etc., and that's going to add to demand, and then you're going to have consumers wanting things to consume, to live, and then governments wanting things for the public consumption, to live together, public lighting or whatever. And then you've got the exports minus imports will be demand for what we produce. So that's aggregate demand. That's what we consider it is. The components, what determines aggregate demand? That's very important for economists, because this aggregate demand is vital for the economy, isn't it? Aggregate demand is the gross domestic product. It's basically the more we demand, the more we will produce, and that indicates the strength of the economy. So what determines it is very important. So we're going to have a look at each component and decide what determines that, to see what would influence it. You've got consumer spending, one of the components, and here is the level of disposable income. Aggregate demand, if in richer countries you have more disposable income, they've got more income and maybe they don't spend it all. So that would be a determinant. If there's more disposable income in richer countries, they may save more. Whereas poorer countries, you have lower disposable income, so higher aggregate demands in comparison to income. If the disposable income rises, that doesn't mean aggregate demand will rise. That may mean savings will rise instead. Also, distribution of income. The more equal people are, the higher the aggregate demand will be. This again is about disposable income. If you've got very few people with all the income, or a major part of the income, they will save a lot of it. If it's more evenly spread, people will have less disposable incomes, and generally spending will go up because there'll be more needs satisfied, and people won't be saving so much. Okay, so distribution of income is very important to this aggregate demand. Also, with consumer spending, we can look at interest rates. If interest rates are high, people will be less likely to borrow money and to pay, you know, on over a period of time. So if interest rates are high, you know, money will be coming out of the economy and going into banks generally, and people will borrow less. So there will be less consumer spending, less aggregate demand. And also pessimism. Pessimism, if the consumers are worried about their jobs, there's a lot of job insecurity, they won't be spending so much money. They won't be buying such great big flash cars and such wonderful holidays. And that will reduce aggregate demand, or alternatively, optimism will increase it. People will be more relaxed about spending. So the other component, investment, here obviously consumer demand will affect. If consumers want to buy a lot, the firms will be investing a lot. Also governments will be investing a lot, because they have confidence that they'll get a return on that investment. The interest rate again will affect the investment. If it's high, then firms will borrow less and invest less, so that will reduce aggregate demand. Advances in technologies might increase or decrease aggregate demand. For example, if you've got better smartphones, the consumers will start buying the latest model, the latest generation, shall we say. People always want the latest generation because it's better, it's faster, it's smaller, it's cheaper, it's got more options to do things. So again, pessimism and optimism, just like consumer spending, this will be affecting investment. Then you've got government spending. Here we've got government policy, that should be policy. If there may be a policy to help the poor, or to create a free market, more of a free market, less intervention, smaller state, that will influence government spending. The more free market we want, the less government spending there will be. So that will reduce aggregate demand, because government's a very big, important component. Tax revenue. If they tax a lot, consumers will be reducing their spending on products, and aggregate demand will reduce. Or demographic changes. Obviously, you know, if there's lots of children, the governments will have to spend a lot on schools, and that will increase aggregate demand. Okay, so we've got those influences, but then we've got the net exports, the exports minus imports. Here we can think about other countries' GDP. If America's getting much richer, maybe they're demanding more holidays in Italy, so aggregate demand will go up in that case. And alternatively, you know, if Italians are getting much poorer, maybe they'll demand less holiday cars, American cars, and that will increase the net exports. So that will increase aggregate demand. Then the competitiveness of our products. If it's very cheap to holiday here in Italy, that will increase aggregate demand, or vice versa. You know, if it's very expensive. The exchange rate, that again will have a big effect on aggregate demand for the same reason, for competitivity. Okay. Aggregate demand looks like this. If we put the price level on one axis and the real GDP, not GDP, the nominal, real is adjusted for inflation, it will look like this. Generally, as prices go down, the GDP goes up and aggregate demand goes up. So, why is this the case? Why does aggregate demand go up as prices come down? You've got the wealth effect. So if prices are cheaper, we can buy more. And so GDP, the output, will be increased. There'll be more aggregate demand and so more GDP. Then you've got the international effect. Okay, so as prices come down, the foreigners will obviously demand more of our products, and that will increase our GDP. The firms will be producing more and GDP will go up. Again, it's exactly the same for the interest rate. So as the interest rate goes up, for example, aggregate demand will go, or prices, the demand for goods will go down because people are borrowing less, and then aggregate demand will go down and GDP will follow it. Okay. There can be a shift in aggregate demand. Here we can see it's shifting from the red aggregate demand to the green aggregate demand. Now, how can we get that shift? Obviously, that is a good shift to make because you've increased the GDP. You've increased demand and you've increased the GDP. Now, normally, price levels will follow aggregate demand on this. But to shift it will take a fundamental change. For example, a fundamental change in consumer expenditure. You've got rising consumer confidence, cutting taxes, an increase in wealth, or a rise in money supply, an increase in population. We can understand these things will mean, just think about an increase in population, will mean more people are prepared to spend more money. That shifts the aggregate demand. An investment could shift it. Again, rise in business confidence, cut in corporation tax. These are all the things which could encourage companies to make more of an investment and so increase aggregate demand. Advances in technology, again, they want the latest robots, etc. Or maybe they want to sell the latest generation of mobile phones, etc. Also, government spending. This could be government policy, a desire to stimulate the economy, or to win some political support. If we're coming up to an election, they'll want to increase aggregate demands and so increase the GDP, hopefully reduce prices. Net exports, a fundamental change here could be the exchange rate changes, so it becomes cheaper to buy Italian produce. That would be a fundamental change, or a rise in the quality of domestic. So if we improve our produce in some way, or we make it cheaper, or maybe their incomes increase in America, this will mean they can buy more and will increase the aggregate demand because that component of the calculations gone up. Okay,